They say a single night can carve a person into something unrecognizable. They say the forest keeps its own kind of score. And on one moonless night in Ridgewood, a young hunter named Lena Hart learned that some battles are not fought for glory, but for the right to breathe one more minute. She was not a soldier, she was not trained for war, but fate had already chosen her. Wolf Squad was never meant to reach the village. They were broken stragglers torn from their regiment, driven half-mad by fear and hatred. And from the moment they arrived in Ridgewood that morning, their desperation turned into cruelty with no limit. They tore through every home, stealing anything they could carry, beating the elderly who couldn't stand, firing at anyone who dared meet their eyes. They dragged women from their doorsteps and treated them as if humanity no longer applied to them. Hungry, frantic, and fully convinced no one could stop them, they turned the entire village into a playground for their blind violence. They feasted on stolen food, forced villagers to serve them, laughing as if war had granted them the right to destroy anyone weaker. By sunset, blood and crying had become the everyday sound of Ridgewood. They believed sunrise would make them kings of the valley. They believed the villagers would kneel forever, but darkness had already chosen someone to answer them. Lena moved through the forest like cold spreading across a grave, silent, certain, unavoidable. She had no rifle, no grenades, no armor. Only a hunting bow, a machete, a spear, and the ancestral tools her family had used for generations to bring down creatures far larger than any man. And on that night, under a darkness deeper than fear, Wolf Squad finally learned what it meant to be hunted. Night fell over Ridgewood, like a curtain pulled by something ancient and indifferent. The fires the Germans lit earlier now smoldered in broken pits, casting long shadows that made the village look like a graveyard waiting for names. Wolf Squad grew restless as the darkness thickened, their drunken arrogance shifting into a predatory paranoia. They shouted at the villagers, paced around with rifles half raised, convinced partisans might be watching them from the trees. None of them realized that only one hunter was watching, and she already knew which one would die first. Lena waited in the tree line, listening to their voices echo through the cold air. She recognized the rhythm of cruelty in their laughter, the metallic tone of fear in their arguments, and the way they kept glancing toward the darkness as if it was beginning to glance back. Every hunter she ever knew told her the same truth. Panic creates openings sharper than any blade. And Wolf Squad was full of panic. They were desperately trying to hide beneath their uniforms. She mimicked the hunter's call, a low, rising howl that rolled across the treetops. The sound froze the Germans instantly, their rifles snapping up as if an animal bigger than any of them had just stepped into the dark. But that sound wasn't meant to scare them. It was meant to measure their reactions, to read their fear, to map which one would be isolated when the moment came. Lena had hunted wolves before, and she knew the fear patterns of packs that were starting to break. One soldier, drunker and louder than the rest, wandered toward the tree line to curse at the darkness. He kicked over a bucket, shouted threats, and tried to prove to the others that he wasn't afraid. But fear isn't something you silence with noise. It's something that sharpens the night until it cuts the fool who forgets where he stands. Lena watched him stumble closer, his silhouette outlined in moonlight like a target chosen by the forest itself. She knocked an arrow, exhaled, and let the silence settle around her. A hunter never rushes the first strike. She waits until the prey believes it's alone, until the night feels safe enough for arrogance to bloom. And when that moment finally cracked open, Lena drew the bowstring back and released the arrow with a whisper that traveled faster than thought. Wolf Squad didn't hear the kill. They only heard the thud of a body falling into the leaves.
Night didn't fall on Ridgewood. It collapsed. Thick, heavy, suffocating. As if the mountain itself wanted to bury what the wolf squad had done. But Lena moved inside that darkness like someone born from it. She crouched low on a ridge, watching the men around the fire, counting them, memorizing their patterns. Rage didn't shake her. Rage focused her. She saw them dragging old Mr. Harlan out of his home hours earlier, hitting him with the butt of a rifle because he refused to give up the last sack of rice he had. She saw them overturning tables, laughing as they burned woven blankets passed down for generations. She saw them take young Mara behind the water barrels, and she forced herself not to scream as the girl's cries echoed between the wooden walls. Every memory scraped itself into her chest, sharpening her resolve like a blade being filed. Lena breathed out slowly. Her father once told her that a hunter kills long before a weapon ever touches flesh. The first kill happens in the mind, the second in the heart, the last merely in the body. Tonight she would prove him right. Tonight she would show these intruders what it felt like to trespass into a forest that did not want them. She touched the handle of her machete. The blade felt warm, as if it remembered hunts from decades before she was born. She slid an arrow from her quiver, dipped the tip into a small pouch of resin she had prepared, and whispered a short prayer to the mountain spirits. Then she let the first howl rip through the dark. It was not the sound of an animal. It was not human either. It was something between the two, twisted into a shape that did not belong to the living. Wolf Squad froze. One man spilled his drink. Another reached for his rifle. A silence cracked open between them. And in that silence, Lena's arrow landed in the throat of the guard farthest from the fire. The man clawed at his neck, choking on blood. The others spun in confusion. They yelled orders, tripping over each other, searching for an enemy they could not see. Lena was already gone, melting into the trees, circling, repositioning. She never stayed in the same place for more than a breath. A second howl rose from the southern trees. Two men fired blindly. Their rounds hit nothing but bark. One of them noticed too late that his partner had stopped breathing. A wooden spear jutted from his chest, thrown with the force no one expected from a girl half his size. He tried to call out, but only managed to grunt before collapsing into the dirt. The remaining soldiers regrouped, faces pale, forming a circle around the fire. Their leader barked orders, telling them to stick together. But fear was already chewing through their discipline. They jumped at shadows, fingers trembling on triggers, breathing too fast to think straight. Lena watched them from above on a rocky ledge. They looked like prey trying to convince themselves they were predators. She hurled a stone into the bushes. 3 guns fired instantly. Branches shattered, sparks burst. The camp echoed with chaos. And in that violent confusion, Lena descended the slope like a shadow with purpose. She swung her machete low, slicing the tendons of the man guarding the rear. He collapsed screaming, his weapon dropping uselessly beside him. One soldier rushed forward. Lena twisted, ducked his grab, and drove her knee into his ribs. As he bent over, she slammed the handle of her machete into his temple. The crack echoed like breaking bone in winter. His body hit the ground before he realized he was dying. The leader finally spotted her. He fired a burst that tore through the branches near her head. Lena dove behind a log, rolled, grabbed a fallen spear, and launched it with a hunter's precision. The spear struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He screamed and stumbled, rage boiling in his voice. But Lena did not give him time to recover. She rushed from the darkness, leaping over the fire pit, her silhouette flickering through flame and smoke. Her machete slashed through the air in a downward arc. He blocked with his rifle, but the wooden stock cracked, splintered, and failed. They struggled against each other in the dirt. He was stronger, heavier, desperate. Lena was faster, colder, deliberate. He grabbed her wrist. She headbutted him. He punched her side. She slammed her knee into his stomach. He reached for a knife. She saw the movement, twisted her body, and forced his arm into the dirt. Then she pressed her machete against his throat. His breath hitched. His eyes widened. In a final panicked attempt, he tried to beg, but Lena had heard enough begging that day. One swift cut. Silence. The fire crackled. The mountain exhaled, and Lena, blood on her hands and smoke in her lungs, rose slowly to her feet. She did not smile. She did not tremble. She simply listened for the next enemy. None remained.
Dawn approached Ridgewood like a slow and wounded animal. Not with light, not with warmth. It crawled in pale and unsure, as if even the sun feared what had happened during the night. The silence was unnatural, thickened by blood that had not yet dried and smoke that still clung to shattered wooden walls. Lena stood in the center of the village square. The bodies of Wolf Squad lay where they had fallen, arranged not by her hands, but by the chaotic truth of death itself. And yet the scene looked ritualistic, as though the night had been an altar and the mountain had demanded an offering. Lena felt none of the triumph a survivor might expect. She only felt the weight of history shifting beneath her feet. Smoke drifted upward in thin spirals, rising through the cold morning air like the final breaths of the defeated. Each curl of smoke seemed to whisper a lesson from the night. Each wisp was a voice fading into the mountain's memory. And Lena realized she had crossed a line that no hunter ever expected to cross. She had always hunted out of necessity, food, protection, tradition. But last night had been something older, something larger, as though she had been guided not by instinct, but by an ancient force that had watched over her family for generations. She remembered the stories her father told her, stories of the mountain choosing warriors in times of great need. Lena knelt and touched the ground. It was still warm. Not from sunlight, from the night's violence, from struggle and breath and final gasps. And when she looked up, she felt the forest watching her. Trees swayed without wind. Leaves rustled in patterns that felt intentional. Shadows moved in ways that seemed almost human. The mountain had accepted her offering, but it also demanded that she understand what came next. The night had not ended her journey. It had begun it.
As the villagers gathered to assess the damage, Lena climbed toward the forest line, not to leave, to listen. The mountain did not speak with words. It spoke with presence. A presence so old and vast that it felt like standing before the spirit of war itself. The trees shifted in a slow wave. A low hum settled into the soil, resonating up through her boots. It was not approval, not disapproval. It was a summons. Every hunter knew the feeling, the call to walk deeper, the call to face the unknown. Lena felt something awaken within her, not bloodlust, not vengeance, purpose, the kind a warrior carries into the next lifetime. She knew the army would come soon, searching for survivors, recruiting anyone with a spine strong enough to stand. But she understood now that her path had started long before soldiers and banners. She breathed in the cold air. It carried the smell of iron, soil, and pine sap, the same scents that had filled the night. But now they felt like a promise, a direction. The world was changing, and war was spreading across continents. Ridgewood was just one spark in a forest ready to burn. Lena placed her palm on the trunk of an ancient tree. Its bark felt cold and eternal. She closed her eyes, letting the forest pulse through her fingertips. When she opened them, there was no hesitation left. She was not leaving the village behind. She was carrying it with her. She descended the slope with slow, steady steps. Each footprint felt deliberate, like she was inscribing her name into the soil. She returned to the village one last time to check on the survivors. They looked at her differently now, not as a girl, not even as a hunter, as something between protector and omen. When the army trucks finally arrived, rumbling like machines scraping against the quiet morning, Lena stood at the front gate. She did not flinch when the officers stepped out. She did not tremble when they asked for volunteers. She only nodded once, as if the decision had been made long before they arrived. The officer studying her face paused. There was something in Lena's eyes that made him straighten his posture. A depth he could not understand, a darkness that did not frighten him but demanded respect. He nodded back. Lena stepped onto the truck. As it drove away, she looked back at Ridgewood. The village was wounded but alive. The mountain towered behind it, silent but watching. And as the truck rolled into the unknown, Lena felt the night's lessons imprint themselves onto her bones. Not the violence, not the fear, the responsibility. Ahead lay war. Ahead lay years of blood and fire. But Lena was no longer just a girl of Ridgewood. She was the mountain's answer. And answers do not retreat. They echo. They expand. They outlive the night that forged them.
The Wolf Squad believed killing was simply a tactic, a repetition, a means to an end. But what Lena did to them, what the forest did through her, was not tactics. It was doctrine. It was principle. It was law. Because Ridgewood had never survived by force. It survived by balance, by exchange, by the old covenant between human breath and the cold soil beneath it. And when someone broke that covenant, when blood was spilled without purpose, the valley demanded repayment. Wolf Squad had ransacked houses at dawn. They had overturned tables, smashed clay jars, dragged old men from their doorsteps, and beaten them until their bones sounded like wet twigs. They stole livestock, set fire to granaries, and shot families trying to flee. It was not hunger. It was not war. It was doctrine of another kind. Destruction for pleasure. Domination for reassurance. A ritual of cowards, needing noise to feel alive. So the forest answered with its own doctrine. The doctrine Ridgewood had followed long before the first stone house was ever built. That the land remembers everything. As Lena stalked them, she felt the shift, not in sound, but in the logic of the world. Trees seemed to lean inward, light bent, breath thickened. The hillside understood the weight of what was happening and rearranged itself for judgment. The soldiers did not know they were stepping into a system, an equation older than their weapons. Every cruelty they committed added a number, a pressure, a counterweight that was slowly drawing them toward a point of collapse. Lena did not fight them with rage. Rage is inefficient. Rage clouds the structure. What she held was precision, an understanding that each strike, each step, each breath had to match the imbalance Wolf Squad brought into the valley. The first soldier she killed died without seeing her face. The second barely recognized the tool in her hand before it opened him like a seam in cloth. The third ran,
but running only accelerated the collapse already written into the soil beneath him. By the fourth, Lena felt the forest speaking through her movements, not in words, but in geometry, angles of force, arcs of motion, ratios of distance to inevitability. Wolf Squad had brought chaos. She answered with mathematics. The soldiers began firing into the dark, desperate to create shape in a world that was collapsing into abstraction. Their bullets tore bark from trees, shattered branches, punched holes into empty air, but nothing meaningful, nothing consequential. The forest does not fear noise. The doctrine of the valley states, noise is the last refuge of the doomed. And as the echoes faded, the soldiers heard what followed. Lena's steps, steady as a pulse marking the countdown of their existence. One soldier tried to speak, tried to negotiate, but doctrine does not negotiate. Doctrine corrects. Doctrine restores. Doctrine removes what breaks the balance. Lena moved through him like a verdict. By the time she reached the last of them, dawn had risen. The smoke from burning houses drifted across the treetops, mixing with the cold breath of the valley. Wolf Squad had arrived in Ridgewood, believing themselves hunters, but doctrine had corrected the error. The hunters had become the imbalance. An imbalance must be removed. Lena raised her tools, not with fury, but with the calm necessity of someone fulfilling the oldest rule of the land, that all things must return to where they belong. The last man fell, not as a spectacle, but as fate completing itself. His breath left with no dramatic cry. The forest absorbed him with the same impartiality it had shown everything else that night. Lena watched and felt the balance settle. She did not celebrate. There was no joy in the end of killing. There was only the knowledge that a debt had been repaid, that the valley's ledger had been balanced for another season. News traveled slow in those hills, but by evening, the story of Ridgewood's single night of retribution had spread to neighboring valleys. Farmers and hunters whispered the name Lena in markets and taverns as if invoking a weathered oath. Her actions became a pattern, then a warning. Commanders took notice. Scouts reported fewer stragglers in the region. Patrols altered their routes. Thieves hesitated at the edge of wood lines where before they had prowled without thought. The doctrine had extended its reach without a single proclamation. Lena herself did not seek fame. She collected no trophies. She tied the tools she used to the butt of a broken post and left them where the mountain could reclaim them. The villagers asked her to lead them to safety. She only agreed when she felt the valley's consent. When recruiters came, they found a woman who moved with the certainty of one who had been tempered by fire. She joined the ranks not out of ambition, but out of duty. The duty of someone who had seen what happens when order collapses into hunger and cruelty. Over time, the doctrine Lena embodied became a lesson taught quietly to new recruits. Survival is not chaos, it is calculation. Kill to stop the pattern, not to feed it. Restore balance. Do not indulge in vengeance. The valley's lessons spread beyond Ridgewood, into tactics and into myth. And Lena, who had started that night as a hunter defending her home, became an example of what disciplined, cold action could accomplish when guided by principle rather than fury.
Dawn rose over Ridgewood months after the night of the Wolf Squad, and Lena stood in a uniform she had earned the hard way. Her unit moved like a single heartbeat behind her, trusting her calm more than any medal. The commanders called her a prodigy, but Lena knew the truth. She wasn't shaped by glory, she was shaped by necessity. By the valley that once demanded repayment and found her worthy of the task. As she marched toward her next mission, she carried no illusions about what war demanded. War didn't want heroes. War wanted discipline. War wanted clarity. And Lena, born of hunters, tempered by loss, understood what so many soldiers never grasped until their final moment. Balance is the only thing that survives the fire. And so her story became more than a tale of one night. It became a warning etched into doctrine, carved into the memory of every recruit. A truth passed down not in textbooks, but in whispers. The world may fall into chaos, but you do not have to fall with it. And if you hold your ground long enough, the world sometimes follows you back to order. From Lena's path, 3 lessons remained. First, that mercy is meaningless when faced with men who worship cruelty, but restraint is never weakness, it is direction. Second, that tools don't make a warrior, purpose does. A bow, a blade, a signal howl, each is as deadly as the intent behind it. And third, that balance is not peace. Balance is correction, often paid in blood. Lena carried these truths into every battle that followed. Some nights she dreamed of the valley, some nights of the screams, but most nights she dreamed of silence. The silence that comes only after the ledger is even again. And when her soldiers followed her into fire, they did so not because she promised victory, but because she promised structure in a world that kept trying to come undone. And now, her name is spoken not as legend, but as instruction, a reminder that one hunter can change the fate of a valley, a unit, a war. And if her story reached you today, remember this: balance always begins with one person who refuses to break. If you want more stories forged in fire and carried by truth, stay with me. Our next journey starts soon.